everybody, and welcome to today's session from the EMBO India Bioscience online seminars. Before I start, I just want to make sure that my audio is clear. So maybe the panelists, if you can hear me, could you just drop a message in the chat box if the audio is clear? Perfect. Okay, so let's get started with today's session. I'm Shantala Haridas from India Bioscience, and I'm very excited to invite you all and get started on today's workshop, which is on grant writing, specifically for senior or late stage PhD students and postdocs. So before we get started with the webinar, I'd like to kind of introduce you to the faces and the voices that you're going to hear today. So as I said, I'm Shantala Haridas. The main presenter today is going to be Chapin, who is going to be your trainer for today's session on grant writing. But before we actually get to Chapin, you'll hear a bit from Smita Jain from India Bioscience and Gerland Wallon from EMBO. And both of them will tell you a bit about the foundation and how this entire EMBO India Bioscience program got started and give you a little bit of an insight into their respective organizations. And also with us today will be Shreya Ghosh. She will be the moderator for the question and answer. So she'll be moderating all the questions that you send in. And joining us on YouTube will be Manjula. And so Manjula will be collecting the questions from all the from any questions from participants on YouTube, and will be sharing it with us on Zoom. So those of you who have joined on YouTube will also be able to kind of take part in the interactive session. And so just to give you, before we start with the webinar, to give you a brief overview as to what you're going to what is going to happen in today's webinar. We're going to begin with Smita, who's going to give us an overview of India Bioscience. We'll then move on to talking with Gerland, who's going to give us an overview of EMBO's activities in India, as well as tell us about the EMBO India Bioscience online seminars, which is a project that was recently launched by both jointly by EMBO and India Bioscience. Then we move on to the main topic of today's webinar, and here the training session will be divided into two parts. You'll have part one, where you have challenges and foundation to writing a grant or fellowship, followed by a question and answer session which lasts a maximum of 15 minutes. And then in the part two of the webinar will be a more practical application to what was discussed in part one. This will be followed by the main or another question answer session, which lasts about 15 minutes. So with regard to the question and answers, you can see we have two question and answer sessions, but do feel free to keep sending in your question and answers to us using the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We will collate them, we will compile them. And if we feel there is something that needs to be addressed outside of these two Q&A sessions, that's also a possibility that we have. So Chapin, the trainer, is very flexible as to how questions are being addressed during the webinar. So now I'm going to hand it over to Smita. Smita Jain is the Executive Director of India Bioscience, and she's going to briefly tell you a bit about India Bioscience. So over to you, Smita.
Thanks, Shantala. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to this session of learning. Before we actually get into the session, I know you all are eagerly waiting for Chapin to start, but very quickly, I would introduce India Bioscience. Many of you might know, but for those who don't know, it's good to very quickly introduce. And India Bioscience has been acting as a facilitator to bring in changes in the life science community across India. And as a concept, this came forth during a dinner conversation about a decade back. And from that point onwards, we've come a really long way in serving the community. Can I have the mandate slides? Yeah. So the 5 mandates across which India Bioscience works is networking, wherein we are trying to form a really large unified network of life science researchers and other science professionals, and we mainly do it through our YIM and regional YIM meetings. Communication is another major vertical at India Bioscience, and we mostly do that through our website, which is our face. In case if you have not visited the website, I would request you all to go and look for the resources, the articles, the columns, and very different kinds of things that we share through the website. Education, data and policy, skill development are few other verticals that take a lot of our time, effort. So these are basically 5 different verticals around which India Bioscience functions. Shadla, can I have the next? Yes. Okay. Coming to the skill building vertical and what brings us here today with all of you, we have been kind of trying to bring in the awareness and popularize various different science careers that are available today. We have done large number of workshops, talks around science careers over last 4 to 5 years. Disha is a book that we recently, in the month of February, early this year, we launched this book, Disha, which is a very comprehensive career resource book for life science students. And this was written by Dr. Suman Govil. Again, all these talks, presentations, informational podcasts, books are all freely available on our website. So please feel free to use any resource that fits your bill. Can I move, Shantla? Yes. Okay. As I said, we've been working around the skill building vertical for a while, and we've done multiple workshops. Crafting Your Career workshop was something that was designed in-house by the India Bioscience team. And we have successfully done large number of these workshops over last little more than a year. We have also done grants writing workshops, scientific writing, journalism, or science administration management workshops. Mostly in partnership with other organizations. And that's when we started the discussion with EMBO. And here we are, we launched the EMBO India Bioscience online seminars. And the first workshop, the grants writing workshop, is what brings us together here. Yeah, so with that, I guess I would hand it over. Thank you all. I hope this would be a really nice learning session. And we continue to stay engaged. Thank you.
Thanks, Smita. So now we'll hear a bit from Gerlind. And for those of you who have either attended the EMBO Grants Awareness Workshop at YIM or our previous webinars with EMBO, Gerlind is a familiar face. You've heard from her before. She is the Deputy Director of EMBO. So over to you, Gerlind.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Shantala, for the introduction. And great to see you guys and working with you. So welcome to the webinar on grant and fellowship writing. Just a few words about EMBO. EMBO is the European Molecular Biology Organization, and we have actually been active in India for more than a decade. And now in 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, in 2016, India has become an associate member of EMBO, which means that scientists in India are eligible to participate in all our programs and activities. More recently, we have teamed up with the India Alliance to support lecture courses in India, in addition to our usual practical courses, conferences, and fellowships. So please check out our recent webinars on how to apply for our programs. These are available from the India Bioscience platform, as Smita pointed out. In our shared commitment to promoting life sciences, EMBO and India Biosciences have joined efforts to bring to the scientific community in India online seminars to update and practice soft skills, which include communication, grant writing, publishing, and scientific integrity. Our trainings are tailored specifically to the needs of researchers at early career stages and aim at improving both the quality and the quantity of research output in the medium and long term. So we're doing also a lot of these skill building activities here in Europe. So we launched this activity in April 2020 jointly with India Bioscience. And I'd like to thank the team of India Bioscience, Smita Jain, Shantala, and the rest of the team for such constructive collaboration on this. So we're very happy to see so many scientists that have signed up to the webinar. We now see 340 participants. So that's excellent. And I guess there will be a few more via YouTube. And we are sure that you will learn a lot from Chapin. And please also watch this space for future webinars. We are working on a few more with India Bioscience. So very much looking forward to you, Chapin. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerland. And so now we'll get to the part that everyone's kind of waiting for. So before Chapin begins, a brief introduction into Chapin, who will be the trainer for today's session. He is the founder of Creducate Consulting. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but do correct me later, Chapin, if I got that wrong. He has extensive experience both in research as well as consulting in science, communication, and publishing, and has a wonderful sense of humor. So I think today's session is going to be informative, fun, and I think all of you are going to enjoy and learn a lot from it. So I'm not going to cut into your time anymore, Chapin. Over to you. I'm going to just stop sharing my slides, and you could start with your presentation. Maybe you could unmute yourself. Yes, exactly.
Yes. Okay. So can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. Very good. All right. And you can see my title slide, I hope.
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I'm sorry I can't personally see all 340 of you, but it's really a pleasure to be with you here virtually, and I hope for as much interaction as possible. As Shantala already explained, I want to keep the floor open for questions, and I count on her and Smith and their colleagues to field those questions so that we can get as many of them dealt with during this 2-hour webinar together. As Shantala mentioned from your own poll results, you're a mixed group. So I have tried to put together something that I hope will give a good foundation to as many of you as possible. Some of you are looking at fellowships. Some of you are looking at grants. What is the difference? There's not a big difference in the sense that you're applying for money for someone to support your research. A major difference is maybe that typically grants is money awarded to a research project, whereas a fellowship is money awarded for a research project but done by a particular person. So very often, for example, a fellowship can be carried with you if you move to a different research institute for whatever reason, whereas a grant may not be. The main difference is in the emphasis on how big a role you as the scientist and your future career play. So in a typical grant proposal that focuses on the project, they want to know about you and your team to know whether you're competent to carry out the work. And usually as part of the grant, that grant agency wants to know that during the research work, that young people like you will be trained to have a better career path, to have a better future. That's a grant. A fellowship is doing maybe the same thing, except there's very strong emphasis on one person, that's you as that principal researcher. So the grant agency or the fellowship agency wants to know that you in particular will benefit from the work that you do during that grant. You will get training to prepare you to become usually an independent researcher. Now, in the past, fellowships and grants could be very academic focused and biased. So grants and fellowships would want to make sure that young scientists like you, the postdoc or the PhD, that you would actually be better able to continue in academic research. But I think now things, my slides have to be reset for some reason. But now there's a more open perspective, so that grant agencies are also willing to support you in your path as an independent researcher, also in industry. So this can depend. These are things that you have to look at. Let me first take a moment here to get my slides back up. I'm not sure what happened there. Let me see. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen and try again. Let me just see, my computer is not ready to work. Okay. Okay, just give me one. Actually, while I'm struggling with this, so I meant to tell you that this seminar is meant to be general. So what I'm going to do in the first part of this seminar is walk through things that I think are philosophically important for you, whether it's a fellowship, whether it's a grant, whatever it's called, yeah. And I also want to kind of preach to you a certain mindset that I recommend that you adopt when you're preparing your application. Again, whether it's a fellowship, whether it calls itself a grant, whatever. All right, so I think my slides are back. And let me now share my screen. Okay, so I think hopefully, do you see that now?
Yes, Chapin.
Good. Okay, we're back. So let's start with the challenges. I want to create the scene for you. Some of you, and actually I was a little surprised how many of you have not had maybe so much grant or fellowship application experience. So let me make sure to try to talk to those people who have very little or no experience, and those of you who are seasoned. I want to create the landscape for you. You want to continue in your research, and you know that you need money for that. So you know you need to go to somebody who can give you money. I want you to be able to enter the mindset of that grant agency, that funding agency. They are like a business. So think, maybe some of you even considered, you toyed with starting your own business, or you have a partner who has started his or her own business. If you've ever really thought about it, you've realized how scary it is, right? Okay, so the idea is you're going to try to come up with a product that doesn't already exist on the market and that somehow is going to make money. Well, as you know, for most of us who aren't geniuses, most products we can come up with already exist in some form or another on the market. So our challenge is to come up with a product that is somehow different enough from the very similar ones already on the market and we have to be able to convince the market that our product has this unique added value, this unique advantage. We have to convince the market to then buy that product. We have to convince them that our product gives them something existing products do not. That's exactly what you have to do in a funding proposal. And it's really a challenge, as we'll talk about in a bit, because most of you, I've seen your responses on your applications. I've seen a bit about the fields you work in, your abstracts. You're all working in fields that are fairly competitive, that are fairly well populated. That means you're competing with research groups that are doing very similar or roughly similar work in the same field. You're all competing for the same funding very often. You're all competing for the same space in journals. And to be honest, actually, a lot of what I'll talk about in this webinar, I hope you will see can be very useful for you when you're packaging your work into a paper for submitting to a journal. Because it comes down to convincing this audience of experts that you have a product that doesn't exist on the market exactly in the form that you're presenting. And moreover, that the way in which you've done your product and presented it and analyzed the data is kind of exactly what, or is something that the field really needs right now. So in other words, there may be many other studies about your gene or your pathway that are on the market, but you've done a certain analysis that answers a question that no one else has quite answered. You've got to get that across to the funding agency as painlessly as possible, as concisely as possible. And we're going to talk in a moment about some strategies that might help you do that. So let's come back to my business example. You want to try to launch a business in a way when you write a funding proposal, and you should look at your funding agency as a sponsor. They're a brand. So that funding agency, whether it's EMBO, whether it's the Human Frontiers Program, whether it's some Wellcome Trust, they're all brands. And when they look at your proposals, they're looking at the future of your product. They're looking at, if we back this horse for this race, if we back this product to be launched on the market in the form of publications, in the form of patents, how will it reflect on our brand? And that's so. The first element that I want to inculcate in you and encourage you to adopt as your mindset when you write your funding proposal is, I want you to think a little bit, to stress a little bit about that sales in a way. How do I convince my audience, this funding agency, that my product, my project hasn't been done yet, needs to be done right now in the field, and needs to be done in the way that I'm proposing to do it. So these are in the same way that an entrepreneur would ask himself, Is this the right time for this particular product in this particular market? What will that mean for the future? That's exactly what a funding agency is thinking about. And so that involves very effective communication. And as most of you know, anyone who's in a relationship, anyone who has a boss, anyone who has family, you know that the gap between what you say and what your audience really understands can be massive, and you will never get it 100%. So, and this you will never get it, and no matter how good you are. So what I want to talk about is some strategies for communication for your funding proposal, whether it's a grant, whether it's a fellowship, whether it's a starter grant, whether it's a consolidator grant, whatever you want to call it. How can you make sure that more of what you want to get across gets across, given the constraints of your funding agency, given their time and attention constraints, given their pressures to back winning horses, to back winning products? And as I mentioned earlier, you have to work hard to differentiate yourself from the masses, from the army of terracotta warriors, from the army of minions. I tried to put both examples in case the demographic is older as well as younger. So the terracotta warriors is more for those of us who are already used to being frustrated that we're clumped in together with many other people, whether it's for promotion for your job level or funding or whatever. Those of you who are younger at heart, or you have small children at home, as I do, you know what minions are, and you know that at first glance, all the minions look the same. They appear on the screen as this enormous sea of yellow. But if you take a moment to look a little bit more closely, whether at the warriors or the minions, you notice that actually they're different and almost unique. So some minions have one eye, some have two, some have hair, some have no hair. Some of the warriors, actually, they're fatter, they're thinner, they have different twists on the mustache or thicknesses of beard. There are differences. You have got to get your funding agency to dedicate just a little bit of extra time to go a little bit deeper into your product, to see beyond what sounds like other products already on the market, to see what makes your product quite specific. And how can you do that? Well, one thing you have to do is you have to be quick, you have to be concise, you have to be patient, and you have to compensate for the fact that your funding agency or even your journal editor, remember I said that a lot of what I'll talk about today I think is very valid also for publishing. This is your audience, these people in the control panel, and they're looking at 3 screens, 6 screens simultaneously. They're juggling many things in their mind. Your audience are researchers also. They're used to juggling many pieces of information and trying to analyze it. So with the limited time and attention span of that audience, who, by the way, are also overstressed like you, they've got too many proposals to look at, too many manuscripts to look at, too much to do. How do you get your unique product across to them? So let's look at that. So I'd like to now take several slides to look at a kind of a foundation for reaching your funding agency as efficiently as possible. So we're going to try to simplify the challenge. It's a big challenge. We know it's a big challenge because look at the failure rates. So for most competitive grants, like the ones you all named, the failure rates are high. So depending, they can be between 50 to 80% or more of proposals will not get funded. Same with competitive journals, right? The rejection rates are well above 50%. So actually, the greater likelihood is that your paper or your funding proposal will fail. So how do we get past that? At least a few extra moments of their attention to wow them. Let's look at 3 dimensions. I think these are the fundamental dimensions for a funding proposal. One is your work new? The second is your work useful for the field? And if you're very basic research, then I want you to think principally in terms of how useful is your work for the field. If your work is clinical, although I'm not sure, I didn't see from among the applicants of this workshop, for the second part of this workshop, I didn't see many clinical, but if it is, how useful is your work for the clinic? Okay, that really applied element. Third is how good quality is the methodology that you're proposing for your project. All these 3 things have to be as good and polished and clear and obvious as possible in your funding proposal. So this blue question mark is there. I want to push you to learn to be very skeptical and self-doubting and self-critical of your proposal. The more strongly you understand your proposal from these three dimensions, and the more intellectually honest you are about your proposal from these three dimensions, the better you will be. Let's look at these each dimension. So for novelty, funding agencies and different calls from the same funding agency can vary a lot in how important the new is. All funding agencies want new. Some funding agencies or certain calls from an agency may want really new and big innovation. They want a revolution, a paradigm shift, a huge jump, okay? Other calls, other agencies, they don't need you to create the next paradigm in cancer research or in microbe mapping, whatever. They would also be happy with an incremental advance that, answers a long-standing question in the field. How do you know that? First is to look at the call. The call should put in detail how big that new needs to be or what they prefer. Okay, I'll give you one quotation from the Human Frontiers program. Here is a quotation from NIH in the US, National Institutes of Health. They write for one of their calls, note that an application does not need to be strong in all the categories, including innovation, in order to have a big impact. And they say, for example, a project that is not by its nature innovative may still be essential to advance a field. So then when you're writing your funding proposal, you can say, okay, we're not hugely innovative. The methods that we use are established. The genes and proteins we're looking at, the pathways we're looking at are known to a certain extent. We're not discovering entirely new genes or pathways. But our work will still have a big usefulness. So we're now on this third dimension of usefulness because of some particular fact that holds for your project, right? That's then where you really want to hit, and you want to hit hard. And that's where you're going to put the emphasis in your proposal over and over again. So my first advice is figure out, mainly from the call, where a strong proposal is expected to be along these three dimensions, especially with novelty. That's where there's a lot of play or flexibility. Most funding proposals, they want you to be as useful as possible for the field. Most proposals want you to be as strong as possible in your methodology. Let's come to usefulness. For usefulness, you want to be very concrete in your funding proposal. You don't want to just say the proposed project will generate new insights into this problem, this disease, whatever. No. Because that sentence can be used for any funding proposal for that field, for that call. You want to be able to encapsulate your usefulness in a sentence or two that only your project does, that almost no other projects do. So you want to be able to say, for example, our project will be useful because it will determine or verify or establish that protein X is a reliable biomarker. Or our project will be useful because it will establish a signature set of genes that can serve as a panel to look at these ecology questions that single gene studies or single marker studies have been unable to do. Something like that is already marking the usefulness of your work in a way that not every other proposal is going to be able to do. And by the way, that also then allows you to link into your methodology. So you want to be able to show that the way that you're attacking this problem that other groups are also attacking, in other words, the way that you're operationalizing the problems in the field is needed in your field, is even better maybe, or at least than what other people are doing. Or maybe it's not better than what other approaches are, but it's a complementary to what other people are doing. You're not just repeating the nth same assay. Those three dimensions you have to really emphasize. Now, these are the same three dimensions I push when I help scientists trying to publish in very good journals. They need to demonstrate that the work they're describing in that paper is as high as possible, at least for that particular journal, on these 3 dimensions, and that it's unique among the various manuscripts that are going to hit that journal from the same field. That's these 3 dimensions. When you come to a funding proposal, I would argue there's a 4th dimension that comes in, and that is this one of you, the researcher. Now, you're always, you, the primary researcher, the one, or the principal investigator, as it may be called on grant, you're always a key player. You've always got the title role in that film. And then your team also has a very important role for any funding proposal. If it's a fellowship proposal, then the you becomes even more important, because the fellowship is for you as the fellow. And there in particular, you have to really demonstrate that this work is going to help you in your career. So this you, this 4th dimension, is where you justify to that funding agency that you are the right person, or a right person, to carry out this novel, well method designed and useful project. And that you, either you yourself already have the skills and experience to carry out the work, and or that you have the right team, the right collaborators, the right partners, that together all of you can carry out this work. So this is the 4th dimension, and this is not in a paper usually, but it is in a funding proposal. And this is where you also want to be as clear and strong as possible. You want to be skeptical and brutal about your project and what it's trying to do, okay? So that you're not basically overselling vagueness in order to sound more important. The funding committee will see right through that. They get it all the time. So even if your project is actually kind of smaller than you might like to say, but the key I would say in the long run, you will be more powerful, more convincing by being more honest about what your project is doing and what it's not doing, because that also allows you then to focus on what you're doing that nobody else is. So even if your project is making a relatively smaller advance, but it's an advance that no one else is really doing, and that advance is extremely useful to your field, you can still have a strong case. What some people do is they think they have to sell the world to the funding agency. They have to sell cures for cancer. No. Okay, so don't shy away from that and basically cloud everything in overselling. What we're talking about, if we want to adopt a little bit from economics, is we're talking about comparative advantage. We're saying, and this comes, say, from economics, we're going to try to say, okay, there are many other studies, there have been many other studies, many other publications that have done aspects related to what our proposal is doing, but they haven't done this. And then we're going to say very clearly, this gap, this knowledge gap, or if it's a very applied project, it could be a performance gap. Some of you might be bioengineers, you might be clinicians. You're not inventing new knowledge, but you want to invent a new diagnostic kit or a new prognostic kit, or you want to invent some device that engineers can use or that doctors can use. That's maybe as a performance gap. You want to justify, no matter how big or small my performance gap is, why is it important for the field right now? What can we accomplish with it? That's your added value. That's got to come out. Please understand your proposal, when you're writing your proposal, your job, I would say, is not to convince the panel of reviewers that your work is good, because chances are it's good. And certainly all the proposals that hit their desk, they're all good, roughly. Your job is to convince the panel that your work is somehow better than the very similar proposals already on their desk. So it's not a fight to say, we're proposing solid research. All the proposals that committee gets will be solid. Your job is to say, our proposal fills this gap, and this gap is really important. And you hope it's more important for the panel than maybe other gaps that other proposals are going to address. Your competitor is not the mass of bad science, because you wrote in your applications the good programs you're trying to apply to. So your competition are also good as like you, and some of them are even better. But maybe their project is not quite as good as yours in terms of the usefulness, in terms of the way it's designed. Your real competitor is the next most similar study. And that's always what I want you to keep in mind as you're preparing your funding proposal. What will the reviewers think? Yeah, they want to use technique A, but technique B is the one I use. It's also very good. Why don't they use technique B? Your job is constantly, during your proposal, is to say, why is the next best thing or the next most well-established thing not what we want to do here? And why does my approach maybe make good sense or even better sense than what you might think? To help you focus doing that, whether it's a funding proposal or a paper, I want you to think about these three big questions. These come from those dimensions. Actually, yeah, 3 questions. They come from actually the 4 dimensions. We're doing a little bit of remapping here. I want you to be able to answer these questions in 1 or 2 sentences. I'm going to bring that together at the end in a moment. You need to be able to clearly say, what is the knowledge gap you're trying to fill? I call this the why of your study. You want to be able to say, once you address that gap, what is the usefulness for the field? What is the what for? What will your project, how will it change the way that theorizing is done in your field, the way that empirical assays are done in your field, the way that diagnostics will be done with that disease, treatment, whatever. What do you expect or want to change in people's practice or ways of thinking or researching as a result of your work? And you want to be able to write that why and the what for as unique as possible to you. So you're not going to say this proposal is important for understanding what causes cancer. That's extremely weak, vague. It's going to land flat. You want to be able to say, we want to know, is this gene really involved in breast cancer? We know it's involved in gallbladder cancer or something, but what about breast? And why is that important? Because we have 30% of breast cancer patients who fail to respond to treatment, or 30% of breast cancer patients who don't present any of the established genetic signatures. So there are other genes out there, and we want to know what they are so that we can understand the complete genetic space for risk of breast cancer. Just as to give you an example of, to be very focused so that it's you versus the next most similar study. The third question I want you to emphasize is the you, the 4th dimension. Why are you the right person to do this? And I want you to do that in just a few sentences, okay? And I'll give you a little example in just a few slides. The other thing I want you to be able to do in your proposal is move smoothly among a very small number of ideas. I showed you that slide of the analysts in the room with 17 computer screens. Your audience of grant reviewers, your audience of peer reviewers for your paper, they've got their own stuff going on in their head. They're juggling many things at once. They start to read your paper. They just read a few of your ideas and they run with it. They start to already create what your project is. You don't want them to do that. You want to keep them focused on your project. You also don't want them to get lost. So you want them to read your work, and you don't want them to wonder, okay, what are actually the answers to these nucleus questions? What are they? They see one big idea over there, they see another big idea over there, they see a third big idea over there, and they get confused and they start to make their own nucleus about your project. And it's never going to be exactly what your nucleus is. Remember the slide I showed you at the beginning? The overlap in communication between the sender and the receiver is never 100%. How can you keep your audience focused on exactly what the few key themes are? Keep them few, because you'll be amazed how quickly people's memory and processing saturate. Keep them few and constantly make the connections. So for example, be able to boil down your project to say 5 key ideas and constantly jump among just those 5 key ideas in your funding proposal. All right, let's look at an example. All right, I'm going to give you what has been called an elevator pitch. The idea is, let's say you're meeting with a colleague. So it's not someone from the street necessarily. It could be someone else in your lab, someone else in your department, someone else at a conference that's related to your work. And you have a minute and a half to tell them exactly what you're doing that doesn't sound samey like what other people are doing. And you want to be able to get across enough to them that they're interested to stay to listen to the rest of your poster, to stay to listen to the rest of your talk, to get an email, follow-up email from you with your research proposal for a collaboration. To have a good elevator pitch, the name, by the way, if you didn't know, comes from the idea that if you have a business idea and you have an investor, you want to try to interest them, but they have very little time for you. So you get into the elevator with them and they're going up to their penthouse suite in the hotel. You have just the time of the elevator ride to get them interested enough so that you can invite them later for drinks to talk about things more. So the idea is, can you very tightly present your nucleus and answer those questions so that that grant agency can see it immediately and say, yes, this is worth to continue reading. This is worth inviting that applicant to give a stage 2 application. As some of you know, many grant calls, you send a stage 1 application with a short version of your project. That's where they want you to crystallize things out into a nucleus. And then if they like that, they will invite you to give the whole story as a full application. But if you didn't impress them with your elevator pitch or your nucleus, they will not invite you to stage 2. As an example of what I mean, let me just give you one bit of text here. I'll read through it just briefly to make sure that you follow. Let's imagine, again, I'm talking to you at a conference, or I'm starting my presentation, or I'm starting my proposal, and you're the funding agency. And I say, okay, protein trafficking, it's important. It includes cell growth, hormone secretion, immune response. Many studies have looked at trafficking. They've used pulse chase radio labeling. They've used microscopy. We, however, are interested in trafficking. We're using high-speed microscopy, and we're looking in real time. Now, if you're like me, maybe the only thing that jumped out as slightly unique in all of this is the real time. Okay, it's the real time. But the reality is there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more going on about that. But no one can see that, and they may already get bored just by listening to this. They don't want to dig deeper and make sense. So let me try a different elevator pitch, and I've added the bits in red. So what I've added is we're looking at protein trafficking, and for the sake of the audience, I'm going to mention exactly the parts of that big idea. Trafficking is big. I'm going to mention the parts that I'm going to look at in my particular proposal. I'm sorry, from protein translation to arrival in ER, from arrival to Golgi, and then onwards. Okay, that's where I'm going to focus. So we know we have other work done. There's always been other work done in your field, and you're not going to focus on that. You're going to give just enough to explain where that state of the art falls flat, where it stops. And so you're going to give just enough, whether it's an elevator pitch, whether it's a grant proposal, whether it's a paper, you're going to give just enough past work, history, to get to the but, to get to the gap that's left behind, because that's where your proposal comes in. But they do not, I'm not going to say something vague like, those techniques are limited. Those techniques have not told us everything we need to know, because every proposal can say that. I'm going to say a gap that I'm going to fill in this proposal. They do not allow accurate prediction for short versus long, for unmodified versus glyco. So that already gives a signal to the panel, okay, that's where this person is headed. And indeed, that resonates with me. That hasn't been done. Then I'll go on to, so building, and I'm going to say building, I should have put this in red actually, building on our previous success in tracking interactions within cells. So here I am, the team, that's my you, the fourth dimension, why I'm the right person for this project. We propose to develop high-speed microscopy in real time. Okay, I already said that in the previous version, in real time, for different types of protein, which I already told you what that means. It means unmodified versus glyco. It means short versus long. And then I should have put this in red. This work should provide basic and preclinical with a powerful tool for investigating what? Disorders and maybe screening. So I chose in this sentence to highlight the clinical implications, the long-term clinical implications. Maybe you want to highlight something else. Maybe you want to say, okay, for basic understanding of invagination during development, for basic understanding of infection of viruses, whatever. Now, we know that involves a lot of these modified proteins. Now, with our tool, you will be able to do that. The point is this last sentence. I want to write it in a way that my project can do, and not so many other projects can already do, and not papers that have already been published can do. I want you, and my advice is And I will stop in just a second now for questions. What I've wanted to show you now so far is what is your challenge to get across to that funding agency, to be heard above the crowd of other minions who also are doing good things. How can you do that? You're going to distill your proposal, no matter how complicated, to say 3, 4, 5 key ideas that are all interrelated. From those 3, 4, 5 key ideas, you're going to describe a gap that needs to be filled by you and your team in the way that you propose to fill it. And you want to be able to do that very concretely in a way the audience can visualize. Long protein, short protein, unmodified, glycosylated, not different types of protein. You want to be very concrete, have that nucleus clear, and what you're looking at right now on the screen, this kind of text can be excellent for as the summary of your project proposal, can be good for the abstract of the journal article that you make later, can be good for starting your presentation, and so on. So these have been some strategies, and in the next part of the talk, I want to look at some specifics about grant applications, and we'll look at these ideas in more applied context. So let me now stop. Let me see what I'm going to do. So I will take this is the slide, and I think I will leave this slide, but Shantala, you're going to jump in, is that right?
Yes, Chapin.
Great.
So I
Okay.
think what we'll do now is we'll just take a few minutes we have been collating all the questions that have come in, and we'll start inviting maybe 1 or 2 people to actually ask their questions.
Okay.
So, and I'm going to invite Shreya who's been moderating the Q&A box to kind of take over now. Shreya?
Dhriti Nagar had a question about the present situation. So Dhriti, can you go ahead?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Thanks for your input so far on grant writing. I enjoyed the presentation. My question was that given the current scenario of COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think the international postdoctoral fellowships for PhD students who want to pursue postdoc positions abroad, how is that going to be affected?
That's a great question, and maybe Gerland could jump in if she's still around at the end. But I have to confess, I haven't been networking recently, especially in light of COVID, with grant agencies. I have seen here and there with some calls that I've helped clients with that, and some of the fellowships that you've sent me. I looked at a lot of those websites. They seem to be moving ahead. So, for example, the UK fellowships, the deadlines for 2020. For later 2020 for submitting applications. I forget if it was the Newton Fellowship, even mentioned that they expected their candidates to, I think they had to start by next March of 2021, but they could start anytime from later in the year. So my suspicion is, my gut feeling is that for the moment, the granting agencies are continuing with their normal review cycles. And it hasn't been a major disruption, but I'm not the expert on that. Of course, I think, unfortunately, the control lies more in the government's hands than in funding agencies, because it will be it will affect visas and residence permits and so on. So I'm not sure anyone much can know. My advice would be to forge ahead as normal, look at the particular call, whether they've accounted for those things. I can tell you that the big EU grants are now seriously relaxing reporting deadlines and the timeframes of grants. So if they already, but this is for money that they already gave. So if they gave money, they're now allowing people much longer to complete the deliverables and the reports. But that's all I can say.
All right,
fine. Thank you, Chapin. Can we have Julie next? Julie Singh.
Yeah. Hi, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
Julie.
Yeah. Hi, sir. Thanks for the valuable input that you gave on grant writing applications. Sir, I'm interested in knowing, like, supposedly, if we have an innovative idea and have some hypothesis, but we are not sure whether that proposed strategy will be the right one. So I would like to know, do we have to have a fallback plan also? And should we mention that fallback plan in our proposed application?
Perfect. That's a great question. And let me just make sure that, and I want to defer the question. So you're on, I don't know what slide number it is, but you're on one. I'm looking at it right now. It's going to come. I'm going to deal with that in detail.
All
Don't
right,
worry.
sir.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Next, we can have Atashi ask a question that actually a lot of you have been putting in the box. So, Atashi, can you go ahead?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you for your presentation so far. It was very good. So I actually wanted to know that before writing a grant proposal, do we actually have to do any preliminary studies before that, like any kind of experiment or something?
Great. I will, this probably will come up in a later slide, but I will say now, look, a general rule is the more that you can, so especially the more experimental your project, in a way, the more unproven it is, the riskier, the higher risk it is, the more you can demonstrate the chances of success by showing preliminary data, the stronger your proposal. This can, however, backfire if I've seen cases where the proposal people, the people writing the proposal, they actually had so much preliminary data that it actually, the reviewer said, but this work then is not so novel. You've already even published some of this in some way, blah, blah, blah. Probably you're not going to have that danger. So I would say in general, the bigger the grant, the larger the amount of money, the more ambitious the grant, yeah, or the call, the stronger your proposal can be, the more preliminary data you have. Of course, if it's a grant that's for earlier stage people, if it's a grant that's for 1 year instead of 5, right? If the amount of money is smaller, they will not expect you to have so much preliminary data. One other comment I will make: some grants and fellowships. I forget one of them that you sent me. I forget. I'm blanking. I have a quotation from their website. They are very clear that they want you to, if you want their fellowship, you need to be changing. I think it's the Human Frontiers program. Now that I remember, they want you to change lab, certainly, and field almost. They want you to make a big change. So in that case, that fellowship, those people cannot expect you to have hardly any preliminary data, because on purpose, they're looking for candidates who are taking themselves a leap in changing specialty. So read the call. Of course, the more money is involved, the bigger the heavyweight the funding agency is, then the better it is to have preliminary, but it varies.
Thanks, Chapin. I think, Gerlin, did you have a comment that you wanted to make on one of the previous questions?
Yeah, it was just about, so I can also put my video on, sorry. This was just about the fellowships that were asked. So at EMBO, we are giving out fellowships. The applications, etc., they just go on as previously. And basically, we are looking to the different, I mean, it's basically up to the different countries and travel restrictions, how this is being handled. It's not really something that is judged by the committee. And what we have done at the beginning was that we gave all our fellows a 2-month extension. And in terms of the short-term fellows, we allow them to postpone their fellowships. I think this is now also how most agencies deal with it. So I don't think in the first instance, you will not have to worry about this. You will then have to deal with the current circumstances in the country that you'd like to visit.
Thanks, Gerlind. Chapin, shall we take a few more questions from Shreya?
Sure.
Or would you like to move on? Okay, so Shreya, maybe you could read out a few of the questions that are remaining.
Okay. Let me read out a few questions that have been asked anonymously in the box. So, yeah. So, what is the most common reason for fellowship rejection? And does it have anything to do with the number of publications that the researcher has?
Okay, that's a very good question. Okay, so part of this, I will partly defer. This is one of my last slides about where I look at common reasons for rejection. Regarding number of publications, a few things to consider, kind of randomly. As I mentioned earlier about having preliminary data, especially for bigger grants, it helps to have preliminary data. Okay, for most funding applications, the committee wants to see that you and your team, or at least you certainly, have a track record working using the methods that you're proposing in your project, studying the particular genes and proteins that you're proposing in your project. They want to see evidence of track record. The easiest way to show track record, past success, is through publications, can also be patents. Of course, if you also have, if you don't have so many publications, don't hesitate to put certain conference proceedings, presentations of any kind to outside groups, can maybe help. So you do need to establish track record. For many funding fellowships, funding applications you all are interested in, so fellowship applications, early career, things that are really tailored for young people like you, they want to see evidence that even by the time you're proposing your project to them, that you are well on your way to becoming an independent researcher, to working intellectually autonomously, that you're able to develop your own project, even manage it, see it through to completion. The easiest way to demonstrate that, are first author publications. Even better are first author publications where you're the corresponding author or shared corresponding with your postdoc supervisor or your PI, your PhD mentor. Grant agencies love to see evidence that you are publishing intellectually a little bit independently or separately from your PhD mentor, from your postdoc supervisor. Again, if you have conference presentations where you can also demonstrate, if you have other patents, whatever, that can also help. So that would be, I think, important. This is not always easy to demonstrate, especially when you're early career. So independent or at the same time as your publications and conferences and so on, within the body of the grant, when you're selling, when you're justifying why you are a good person to do this project, don't hesitate to write things like, so from my previous experience using this same assay, or from my previous experience, I will draw on my previous experience working with the, similar mouse lines or similar assays. And then you could, if possible, cite publications that may be from a totally different lab from when you were an undergraduate. Doesn't matter. The point is, within the body of that grant, be very explicit about parts of your project that you came up with, that you designed, that draw on your unique abilities, that come from your own experience, that may be separate from the publication list of your lab, right? That may be separate from the publication history of your mentor.
Thanks, Chapin. Sorry, am I audible?
Yep, to me, yeah.
Thank you. So we have a lot of other questions, and some of these are really relevant, but perhaps some of these are going to be answered in your presentation going forward. So maybe we can move on now.
Absolutely.
And we'll come back to the questions at the end of the session again.
I think that sounds good because, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay, so shall I proceed?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right. Well, look, let's get then in this last part, and it's great that you've already got your questions out of the way. So now you can focus on what I'm going to say. Your questions have been logged into the system. So let me talk now for the remaining slides more practically about funding proposals. Now, when I say practically, please realize the next slides are intended to be universal as much as possible. These are, I've put together almost universal points that I think apply to whatever the funding proposal is. Of course, different calls, different types of proposal will differ, and that's where you're free to ask questions or whatever. But I want to focus on general because these, in the end, I think make more difference sometimes than even the small details, idiosyncrasies of individual proposals. Before I get into that, I think some of you were interested in, how do you find a host lab? Look, so how do you find a lab to sort of go to them and say, let's partner, can I apply for a fellowship to do something in your lab? And I can tell you this from experience working with my clients and also from my own experience when I was a researcher over many years. I was jumping, I changed countries several times, I changed environments several times. So I have some experience myself trying to find partners, right, in a new country, even in new fields. I changed fields multiple times during my own research training. And in my experience, and this is also the case with a lot of my clients, you shouldn't be so afraid about finding a host lab, because most of the time, if you go to the lab, if you go to a PI, write to them and say, I'm so-and-so, I've admired your work. My work aligns well with it, or my interests align well with your work because I've also been looking at blah, blah, blah. How would it be if I came to your lab with a 2-year fellowship to work on da, da, da? Most of the time I would say PIs are very happy to let someone into their lab who has their own money. Because if you're not going to cost them money, they're often open. Yeah. The problem is that if you're asking them for their money, that's a completely different animal. So I would say when you're looking at laboratories to maybe start the next phase of your career, be emboldened and encouraged by the fact that most PIs, most principal investigators, are generally keen on fresh talent, on someone with your perspective. Just realize that almost always they're interested as long as you don't cost them more money. So, then it's going to be up to you to work out to say, all right, look, here's why I'm going to be very good addition to your lab. Here's why my applying to this fellowship proposal is going to cost you and your lab almost zero effort, because I'm going to draft these parts. I'm going to send you things for feedback. But basically, when you're approaching labs, you want to make it sound like you bring them a lot, but you're going to cost them very little financially and in terms of time. That would be my one major piece of advice. So let's imagine you found a host lab. You've started to go back and forth with them to create a proposal. What are grant agencies going to want to look at? They're going to want to look at how strong is your project. So, and let me give you just some very big themes that I want you to be aware of, and some of these you've already asked about. First of all, how big is your project? So that gap that your project fills, is it incremental or is it something bigger? And words vary. Is it revolutionary? Is it paradigm shifting? Is it profound? Is it impactful? Is it innovative? Okay, whatever that means. Understand that the word incremental and the phrase incremental advance are generally bad words. So be careful. Do not write a funding proposal where you say our work is an incremental but very useful advance. Okay, I don't ever call yourself incremental. Let them do that. Just emphasize the usefulness of it, right? So calls vary a lot in how big is big enough of a gap for them, and that's sometimes impossible to predict. Read the call closely to see what they say about that, and talk to your host lab about what they're looking for, what you're looking for. Yeah. Geraldine can maybe jump in at the end, but I want to suggest that if it's a fellowship application, that if you look at the strength of the proposal compared to the strength of how much that proposal builds your future career as a star independent researcher, that your particular project may be even 40%, and then the potential for your future building into a star is maybe 60, whereas a grant proposal is more 60-40, where 60% will be on the particular project you're proposing to do right now, and 40% or less is based on future career building. But that's something you have to, maybe Geraldine can weigh in, something that will depend also on the call. I already talked about that. Are you addressing a knowledge gap or an application gap? You do want to be as concrete as possible about the potential usefulness of your project for patents, for devices, for kits, for commercialization. You also want to be clear on the usefulness of your work for just basic research, for future experiments done in that field, for future model building, for future theorizing. Just be very concrete. So if you're not going to be applied at all, but you're going to be fundamental new insights, then say that and really explain why those particular fundamental insights are really important right now in the field. Another key question you want to be honest about when you're presenting your nucleus, when you're presenting those 4 dimensions of your project, is short-term versus long-term. One thing I will tell you to maybe help you get in the mindset when you propose a project is, I think most grant agencies, just like most reviewers and editors of journals, they will judge the quality of your work, not so much based on the work you will do during that project, but on the work, the experiments, the theories, the devices that become possible in the future as a result of your work. So grant agencies, I told you at the very beginning, they want to build their brand. They want to show to the world, to their own governments, to their stakeholders, to their donors, we back projects that make an impact after 5 or 10 years. Then you want to show that will be the case with your project in your funding proposal. It's okay. So some agencies are maybe 5 to 10 years. Other agencies are happy with a few years. Then show that. So and be ready if you have the chance. If you can clearly map out a couple of benefits after 6 months and after 2 or 3 years, don't hesitate to lay that out very clearly, short and long term. Next idea, and you asked about this, risks and contingency plans. One of the first questions that the grant panel will ask is, how risky is this project? Remember, think of it as a business proposal. That grant agency wants to back a winning business proposal. So if they read your work and it sounds, it's really innovative, it sounds really, but everything in that proposal is untested. The method they're using is untested. No one's even really looked at that protein. No one's even blah, blah, blah. So there's a high risk. And from looking at the proposal, we don't see evidence that applicant is aware of how risky this is. So there's a possibility that they will go into this project and after 3 months, they will have nothing. And then that's our money wasted. We haven't backed a winning proposal. So when you write the proposal, you're going to be very explicit about where you see major risks. Okay, this assay may fail. And then in the proposal, you're going to say, what is our plan B? And usually you don't go into so much detail about plan B, maybe a few sentences with a couple of literature references, but you explicitly acknowledge that there's a need for plan B here, and this is what it is, and this is why my team and I are still a good team to apply plan B, because most of your grant proposal you spend trying to convince that panel that you're the right team to do plan A. But now you're telling me you might have to do plan B. Well, then you also need to justify why you're the good team to do plan B. So you need to engage with that risk, because one of the common mistakes is that the panel thinks that, okay, you acknowledged risk over here, but actually there's also a lot of risk over here. They don't even mention that. They certainly don't mention plan B. We're worried because we see that maybe 1 year of this project will go and then it will stop. And what's worse is when you've built your aims and objectives in a cumulative way so that your project will work for 1 year, but it cannot go into year 2 because you needed it will work for 1 year, and then you start year 2, and then year 2 stops, and then because year 2 stops, you can't do any of year 3 because all of year 3 depends on year 2, so the whole thing just collapses like a house of cards. The last part is related, this feasibility preliminary data, okay? So because of risk that you put down explicitly in the proposal, if you can address, you want to have a plan B. Another way to address risk and your readiness for risk is preliminary data. Say, look, we're going to screen 2 million genes. And this is risky because assays they don't have a specificity. They always miss 5%. Here's my reference. But we do know, we've done preliminary tests, and we know that actually when we tried to screen 20,000, that we got 98%. So we feel confident that we can scale up from 20,000 to 2 million. That can help. So this slide these are what you might want to think about to make your project very strong. Remember, there's a fourth dimension, especially when it's a fellowship linked to you as a person. It's you and your team. I mentioned track record already. I mentioned autonomy already. That grant committee wants to see that you have evidence that you can take a project from start to completion, preferably completion in the form of publication, but if not, could be as a patent, could be as a completed presentation at a big meeting. They want to see evidence of that. They want to see evidence that you have been gradually becoming intellectually independent of your elders, of your mentors, of your supervisors. And yeah, and that's in the past. Now let's look now for this particular proposal. They want to see in this moment, regardless even of your history, do you have the intellectual resources? Do your collaborators have the intellectual resources to handle this project that you're proposing now? Do you have the material resources? And here is what this is why in grant and funding applications, you want to have some part of it dedicated very concretely to what are the core facilities, what are your individual labs facilities, what what resources will you draw on through your collaborators? I'll give you an example. So I think all of you will get the links from IndiaBioscience for some. I gave you 2 examples of NIH proposals, and I don't like to be biased with NIH. It's just because they've been ahead of the curve in sharing grant applications with the world. So it's easier to find completed examples of applications. And there you can look at those and you'll see it's extremely detailed. You shouldn't have to go to that level. But there it's a good example where they really are going into detail about what they can do. And in those proposals, you'll see at least one of them is it's a revised proposal. So it's been submitted now in response to peer comments from the panel. And one of the comments from the panel was, you're proposing to do a chunk, so you're doing most of the work in your lab where you have a track record, but you're proposing to do this important module of the project in a different lab, in fact, in a different country. And this could be a problem, because how are you going to you might be able to get in vitro samples across the border, but how are you going to, you're doing things with mice, you're not going to be able to ship mice very easily. And in response to that, the applicants, they cut that part of the proposal, or they modified it so that they could do more of it in-house. So resources can be an issue. That's something you want to look at. The last thing is future potential so what is the potential so let me go backwards. So this, we said strength of your project, okay? And under that, we have long-term benefit. Remember what I said. Your project will be viewed as strong as long as it creates many possibilities for future science, okay? So even beyond what you're proposing to do now. Similarly, there's a part of grants and there's a big chunk of fellowship proposals where the panel wants to see that by you doing this work, you will become more likely to be more successful in the future. So that agency is saying, okay, if I back this person, are they then going to be more likely to get funding and be able to continue, or are they going to drop out and go into a completely different line of work where we can't track them anymore and we can't point to them as one of our successes as a brand, as a funding agency? So you want to address that. No grant panel is asking you to sign on a dotted line in blood that you're going to continue to be in research for the next 10, 15 years. They know that that won't be the case for a lot of you because there just aren't jobs right now. And not just right now, there never were. But they want to know, okay, will we still give you tools that will help you to be prominent down, at least in the shorter term, doing research, and down the line, helping the cause of science. All right. Actually, before I forget it, this discussion we've had about fellowship and grants being slightly different about you, the emphasis on you. I like this quotation. This is from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which several of you, and I actually had an Indian colleague here in Germany who just finished one. The von Humboldt Foundation, for their fellowships, they say, our foundation sponsors people, not projects. Consequently, the applicant's own scientific qualifications should be the focus of your review. So that's just one example of where some fellowships really will say 70, 60, 70, 75% you and your track record, your skills, and then your potential going forward. And the remainder, 40%, 30%, is the specific project you're going to do during your postdoc or whatever. So be aware of that. Read the call closely where the emphasis needs to be. Okay. All right, I just have a couple more slides about with grants and competitiveness. Here's this particular example comes from the Human Frontiers Science Program. But I put this just as I could have picked from almost any other agency. Most grant calls are the same. They want excellence of the applicant. They want excellence of the research. They want excellence in the environment. They'll all just write it in slightly different ways. I won't read through this, but this is really very general, or almost universal rather, what will be the case. So that's where you want to really focus your proposal and use concrete expressions, phrases like, our lab is particularly well suited for this work, or this work aligns well with the work that I've done in the past because I have throughout my work, I have focused on gene X and blah, blah, blah. So don't, probably in India, I have enough experience with Indian colleagues that I think it may be common in India, as in some parts of Europe, that you tend to be very deferential. You don't feel good selling yourself. You don't want to use I or we. You don't want to say we are a strong candidate or something. Just, I'm not saying you should write like that. One benefit of writing like that is you write shorter sentences. But even if you don't want to be very forward and very American in selling, definitely be explicit. So say something like, this work, this proposal aligns well with the strengths of the lab because, I mean, say that, or it aligns well with what we have available in our core facilities or something, or our core facilities have extensive experience dealing with screening large numbers of genes, publication 1, publication 2, publication 3. You have to accept the fact that it's highly competitive when you apply for money. It's more and more competitive. And you need to sell your nucleus. You need to sell your project and that just is the way it is. Don't do it with vague sales, like massive insights, paradigm shifting research. They've seen all those phrases time and again, they don't like them. Where you're going to affect your panel, where you're going to impress them, is in being very concrete. This project will let's imagine you have a gene that maybe it's involved, maybe it's not. The field is dying to know, just give us an answer, yes or no, and you're going to do that. So you could say, we're going to screen 2 million genes in an effort to what's the word I'm blanking, definitively determine if this gene is important or not. Because if it is, it may mean the possibility of all these downstream kits, because this gene has already been studied every possible way. We know everything about it. We just need to know, is it involved? So maybe you can distill it that way, but just capture why your work is needed right now. You've got to sell it. All right, when you operationalize your work, okay, you need to write very strong aims and objectives. Different grants call them different things. Aims and objectives comes from the NIH tradition, even specific aims, they call them. This could be called something else with a different call. The point is, what are the goals of your proposed project? These you really want to think carefully about, and I would recommend don't think about them until you come up with an elevator pitch, until you've come up with your universe of 5 and a good nucleus. Try out that universe of 5 and that nucleus on colleagues, preferably on some colleagues who are very close to your work, but also on 1 or 2 colleagues who are outside your field or a little bit outside your protein, your gene, your pathway, to see if you're missing big holes, to see if you're saying things that sound, even to that non-expert audience, that sound samey, like, don't we already know that? Get that nucleus completely tight and unique to you, make an elevator pitch, and then look at your aims, writing those. And what you may find is it's going to be an iterative process of cross-referencing, cross-correlating. You'll start with a draft of an elevator pitch. You'll use it to draft some aims. Then you'll say, no, wait a minute, we don't want to do that. We can't do that in 2 years. That would take 10 years. Let's go back, and then you'll go back and adjust your elevator pitch, your nucleus, and then so on, and make it an iterative process. Your games need to be coherent. If you're going to have 3 objectives, the panel, what are they going to look at? Do they have too many objectives for the time that they're asking for the money they're asking for? Are they going to overstretch themselves? Do they have too few objectives? Will they finish this in 6 months? And then what are they supposed to do then? Whatever number that you list as your objectives, they must be interrelated, deeply interrelated, either, for example, because they build one on the other. Okay, first, we're going to collect samples from 15 different sites. And this is more impressive because no one has collected samples from such a diversity of sites. Once we have those samples, we're going to screen them for 2 million genes. And this is impressive because no one's looked at 2 million. Everyone's looked at monogenic. We want to really look exhaustively in a unbiased way at the whole gene landscape. And then in the third aim, we're going to correlate the top 10 genes that we find with blah, blah, blah outcomes in patients or something. So each of those, each objective requires that the previous one be completed. So you could build your objectives that way. Or you could have parallel objectives. They happen even literally simultaneously in parallel, but they have to be deeply related. You do not want the panel to look at your project and say, okay, so at roughly the same time, they're doing this gene stuff, then they're doing the in silico stuff, then they're doing in vitro stuff, and they have patients. But this seems really weird to me because I think that the in silico stuff should depend on the results from the gene stuff. I think that the patient work should not come until the whatever. Maybe you accounted for that in your Gantt diagram where you stress when you'll do each part of your project over the 2 years or so, but you don't want them to read your list and it's not, you haven't wired that in. You haven't said, okay, first we're going to do this. So put a first, put a second, put a third. So in phase 1, call it phases. In part 1, we will do this. And then in each aim, you're going to say, this will answer this question, which will give us these results, and that prepares us for, that raises the following question, which is our aim 2, then, and that will do that, and then aim 3, and so on. All right? So be very careful with that. Make sure that you have milestones and deliverables. So if your work is over 2 years, it's really good if you will get some concrete results that you can patent, present at a conference, even write up in a paper after 6, 8, 12 months. These grant agencies like deliverables, okay, in general. So patents, maybe presentations at conferences, publications, public dissemination things, white papers. Maybe you'll have a lecture to public. A lot of grant agencies, they want a component of public outreach. But I want you to when you write your proposal, incorporate those deliverables all along the path of your work. In other words, milestones. In a way. So, okay, when we reach part 6 months of the project, we should have a signature of 7 genes. So, and this may be the subject of a paper you'll start writing at that point. It may be a patent, it may be I don't know what, but it's a deliverable. So I want you to have deliverables along the way regularly, because that then increases the chance that during the whole grant period, you're going to have deliverables. So even if things fail in month 12, you have deliverables you can publish or patent from month 8. And the milestones are also critical for the following. Milestones are critical as decision points. Grant agencies, especially the longer the grant, the more money. They want to know that you have wired in decision points along your work so that you can decide, is this working? Because if it's not, we need to switch to plan B. They want to see that you have conscious decision points regularly along your project where you will assess how it's going, what you might need to improve, whether you need to switch course. And if you do, they want you in the proposal, they want you to predict what those course A, course B, course C might have to be. Are you prepared to engage in those courses of action and so on? Milestones and deliverables are critical. And then with this, yeah, we've kind of talked about this. Yeah, I don't want to, let me end now this part and then I want to leave for questions. I hope we have questions time. Just general mistakes. I've already mentioned some, so I'll go maybe a little bit quickly. Your proposal is too broad. You're proposing to do too many things for who you are and what your background is, what your lab has shown a track record for, what your center has shown a track record for. Don't try to solve everything in one thing. The work isn't new enough because even what often happens, because people are obsessed with having preliminary data before they ask for money, is you've already done the work. So you have to balance this. You have to be careful with that. They may look at your application and say, oh, you're too junior. You don't have enough track record. You don't have enough experience. So if you already know, if you're intellectually honest and you know that the people publishing in the field where you want to go, that, parts of the field are really mature, these are big labs, be ready to comment on how you expect to play head to head with them through collaborations, through partnerships, through networking. You don't necessarily have to have that lined up when you write the proposal, but you do want to wire it into the proposal that you're going to go to certain meetings, maybe that you're going to reach out to certain teams. Maybe you could email them before you submit the proposal, and they can email back that this sounds really interesting and we would be interested in collaborating with you. And then you can include that in your proposal. And then justification, and that's it. And I think with that, there are, of course, many reasons your proposal will fail, but these are some of the more common. These, in fact, a lot of them come from the proposal, the comments that you'll see in the 2 example NIH proposals, and I picked them because they really come back up time and again. So with that marathon, I hope you kept up. I will stop, and really now it's open to Shantala and the question and answer session.
So I'm going to hand it over to Shreya to maybe kick off the second question and answer session. Is that okay with you, Shreya?
Yes, Shantala.
I'm back. Yeah.
Chapin is back, and we can get started because
Shantala, I'm also encouraged by the 91% who found it useful, but I think they're biased because if they don't answer positively, they know that we'll stop the session and we won't answer their further questions. This is the problem, but okay.
Okay. Before we move on to the live questions, I think I'll read out a question that's come in anonymously, but I'm sure that a lot of us here are thinking about this. So, Chapin, how important is it to have a good grasp of the English language for writing a grant application?
Yeah, that's one of those questions without an answer. My advice is, assuming you have some money available, and I think that you can, okay. So my advice is not to worry so much about English per se. So I do a lot of training in this area, and I think I can say with confidence that most researchers, their problem is not their English language. Their problem is what information they say when, whether it's a paper or a funding proposal. Do they present that nucleus clearly enough? Do they repeat that nucleus often enough through the proposal? Do they reduce their universe of ideas to just 3 or 4 or 5 and then just jump around those ideas with clear interconnections? Or do they present lots of one idea, switch kind of randomly to another big idea, spend a lot of time on that, then come back to the first idea, but now the audience is confused? What to say when is one of the biggest challenges of writing your science. And this is a big challenge whether you're a native speaker of English or not. So my advice would be to really focus on that nucleus and universe of 5, get that solid, try it out on colleagues, then write your proposal. If your colleagues give you feedback or you in your gut, you feel like it needs polishing, you can hire companies. You have many companies now. Okay, and this is no conflict of interest because I have such a company, but I know there are many out there and they can all help you. And the cost, of course, if you have a friend, even better, but cost can be 250 to several hundred euro, okay, for, say, a polishing of the language. I would say that, yeah, you want your English to be professional, but, looking at this, what you've submitted on your, some of you on your applications, at least my experience with Indian scientists, I think that you shouldn't be so worried. Where you should worry is making sure you should be worrying the same way as all grant applicants, and that is the real uniqueness of my project out there?
Sorry. Thanks, Chapin. We'll have a live question now from Vinit Joshi. Vinit, are you here?
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Hello.
Hi, Chapin. This was a very nice presentation, really splendid.
Oh, thanks.
I'm a clinician. I'm an eye surgeon, and I have been a part of Research Institute. And I'll tell you a peculiar problem. I find it very difficult many times to find a middle way between the clinician perspective and the researcher perspective to go ahead to and write the nucleus part of the grant, even the universe part. So any tips for clinicians to put forth a successful pitch?
Well, I'm curious. Okay, what do you mean by you have problems negotiating a middle ground?
So what happens is,
Oh, I see. Sorry, one second. Okay, good. Here I am. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So when I have written one grant till now. So I'll tell you the experience. The procedure of writing for me as a clinician involved highlighting a peculiar set of problems that we face down in the clinics while treating patients.
Sure.
But it had to be really polished to almost 70 to 80% extent when the other researchers got involved. Eventually it got through, but what I realized was that you really have to find a middle ground to actually get forth a project ahead, especially for writing a grant. I don't know if I'm clear, but
look, it's a bit vague. I mean, you're lucky in the sense that I do a lot of consulting work with biomedical scientists, and actually even more of my consulting work is with clinicians. So I understand, I think, the energy that I'm hearing in your voice. The particular challenge you talk about, in my experience and what I do with my clients is any audience, so any researcher, or any biomedical researcher, whether they're basic or a little bit more applied, anyone who works with life sciences, they can generally understand usefulness. Okay, so is this trying to improve? So, and by that, especially since you're a clinician, you're generally trying to improve something. Yes. You're trying to, right, detect a disease earlier, or detect it in a higher percentage of cases, or predict prognosis earlier or better, more accurately. You're trying to improve treatments. You're trying to improve something. So anyone in your audience can understand that if they see that. And then the question becomes, okay, so we've heard of this disease, we've heard of this diagnostic process, or we know that this disease has been around for ages. Doctors are obviously diagnosing it somehow. What is your method? How is it purporting? How is it promising to be different? So they need to see that. And that's where, yeah, you can have a problem with jargon. So if you want to say, okay, look, we have this eye disease, and it's typically diagnosed in this way, but actually that misses up to 15% of cases. We think that, and that way that misses 15% of cases is based on blood testing. But actually, we have evidence that by looking at this non-invasively at this part of the eye, we can see it without doing any blood testing or something. Mm-hmm. I mean, anyone can understand that. Mm-hmm. I suspect the problems that you've had may be due with jargon, maybe due with particular words, and the fact that maybe you didn't. It can be a challenge. A clinician will start very detailed, say. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at this disease using this diagnostic criteria with this technique modality, and then you get into numbers, and very quickly it's hard to where's the big picture? We just see the individual trees. But I would be happy. You have my email address. Write me, give me maybe a concrete example of what you've talked about. But it can be done, and I think it comes down to coming back to the usefulness of it, and saying, this is where I want them to get. I want them to see the usefulness of using the eye non-invasively, as an example, to diagnose this condition, because otherwise we'll miss people, we'll have false negatives, and then work backwards from there. Okay, so that means I need to introduce them to the fact that we don't use the eye right now, we use blood testing. Okay, and why is that limited? Why is that a problem? Because it misses 15%. And then by working backwards from your end goal, that end elevator pitch kind of, then you can maybe figure out how you have to structure the ideas and create a flow through your state of the art, through that history of the problem that gets them to the current proposal of yours.
I think that helps. Yeah, thanks.
That's the best I can do with what I have. But write me if you want. Yeah,
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll take a question from our YouTube viewers who have also been sending in their comments. So Aditi wants to know, does dabbling in science-allied careers like science writing, science illustration, administration, etc., work against the grant applicant in at any point?
Okay, so I assume the person's asking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I missed the very first part. I assume they're asking if they are showing track record and they're showing their CV as part of their grant proposal, and someone would see that they're engaging in these parallel activities like science writing. Yeah. Will that count? You think that's what they're asking, yeah?
Whether that would count against them. Yes, that's what they're asking.
No. So I want to give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is I don't think that will matter. The bad news is it won't matter, because at the end of the day, they're going to be very focused on the metrics of success that committee has. And most grant panels, their metrics of success are publications is the gold, and then patents, gold, silver, yeah? And then conference presentations, other evidence of track record is maybe rusty iron or something. So they want to see that evidence. So whether someone gives them a CV full of random activities like snowboarding, they're going to look at your science, they're going to look at your activities that inform the skills and experience you'll need to do the project that you propose. That's what they're going to look at in any case. So no, it cannot count against you. And actually, I think more and more grant panels, most of them, they're active researchers. They know that for young researchers that there aren't jobs forever for everyone in research. And you all need to be developing your so-called soft skills. They actually need to become your hard skills maybe at one point in your career. So I think this is becoming normal. And the particular example this person gave about scientific communication activities, well, of course, I'm biased, but that's my profession. I think getting involved in that and practicing how to communicate complicated research to different audiences can only help you write a stronger proposal, because it's going to teach you to learn to think like your audience. And the more you can do that, that's exactly what I've been trying to tell you the whole day today, is to think like that grant panel. They're distracted, they're overburdened, they're volunteers, they're underpaid, and they're looking at your nth proposal. They have 10 on their desk just today, and they want to know immediately, what is this proposal going to do that the others aren't going to do, and how important is that to me?
Thank you. I think that answers that quite comprehensively. We'll take one more live question now from Divij. Divij, you've been unmuted. Are you there? Divij Kinga? We'll give it a few seconds.
Shreya, maybe we can take some questions.
Yeah.
You can read some questions in the meantime.
Yeah. While we wait. Okay. So one question that many people have asked is about people who are switching fields or who may not have publications or data in the field that they are moving into. How would they just bring in that fourth dimension that I'm the most suitable person for this grant?
Yeah. That's a great question, mainly because, first of all, it's going to be the case for a lot of you, and it's also my own personal journey. So when I went from my PhD to my postdoc, I changed everything. I changed country. I changed, field. I changed methods. I changed everything, just really in every. And I wrote a large NIH grant, and this was an issue. Look. It depends on the call. So first, read the call very carefully. Let me give you, I like this quotation. This is from the Human Frontiers Science Program, and they say, we want applicants to change their research direction substantially. They do not want a proposal that sounds like it's going to come from the lab where you did your postdoc or your PhD. They want you to change. So there are some fellowships that are in particular targeting people like you, the questioner, who wants to change fields. It is true that on average, most grant funding agencies, they want to have some, I can't say guarantee, there's some indication that you can do what you're proposing to do. So it is, the more you change from your track record to this current proposal, the more you change, the higher the risk for the grant agency. So that means that you just, my advice is not to desist from applying. Apply for the funding, but I would face head on and explicitly in the proposal why you, despite changing fields, are a good, among the best, one of the good or one of the best candidates to do the proposed work. In my case, for example, what I was doing was I did my PhD in protein biochemistry and structural biology. And then I wanted to go to a lab in neuroscience that focused on the cellular and organismal level. And I was going to come in and create basically a protein and molecular line of research in that lab. So it was really a chance, it was really a great kind of synergy where they would bring in all the organismal and the neural, and I would bring in the molecular and the protein focus and techniques that they didn't have. And it was going to be a great marriage. And actually, where that proposal got shot at, it was weird. You'll get this. Please don't be too dismayed. But on some of your grants, if you get reviews back, for a lot of fellowships, you don't get reviews back. They don't want you to revise it and send it to them again. Maybe after only 2 years you can. But if you apply for, say, a typical grant proposal that goes to a committee and you'll get reviews back and maybe they allow you to revise it, you'll probably find, as I did in this case, we got 2 reviews back. So one review was a whole A4 page of this is just horrible, awful. The second review was literally 1 sentence saying this is wonderful proposal, fund it. It's just, and you're thinking it's the same proposal, 2 completely different views. So the negative one, because it was so negative, it won in the end. We didn't get the grant, but in that grant, one of their comments in the review was, this project is fishing. It doesn't have a clear hypothesis. And so what I want to suggest to you, especially if you're switching fields, is you may want to make sure that that project you're proposing in your new field, in your adopted field, that you have a clear hypothesis that has strong reasons for being, that you can support in the literature. Because if you're proposing something quite innovative and one of the main people is coming from a different field, as you might be, then you want to be absolutely sure that your project has a clear end goal with milestones and deliverables, because that's too much risk. We have a project that's already kind of fishing. They're going to screen 2 million genes, but they don't even know if they'll find one that does exactly what they want. And second, the person running this project doesn't have this track record in the field. That may be too much risk.
Thanks. We'll take one live question now from Pooja. Pooja, if you can come.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
So I had this question regarding the timeline. How do we even frame the timeline when we're going to apply for a grant?
Yeah. Well, the shorter answer is the grant agency, the funding agency, frames the timeline for you, right? They give you deadlines. Look, just like I showed you that first slide with the circles showing how what you say to your partner, to your mother or father, brother or sister, you know, the gap between what you say to them and what they understand is huge, okay? Same with meeting deadlines. So if you have a proposal that requires input from N people, it's going to take N squared, you know, days, as it were, hours to do. It's an exponential increase in time and inconvenience and frustration, the more people are involved. So you have to be very wary of that. So as many would probably say, get started at every step as early as possible, and you drive things. Don't hesitate to push, be polite and diplomatic, of course, but don't hesitate because very often if you're a PhD scientist or a postdoc and you're applying to some, let's say, UK lab, they don't know you. They don't, especially now, probably you can't even travel there for a visit. So they don't have any feel for you. You don't mean anything to them except to hear someone will come to do some interesting work if they get money for it. So you're very virtual for them. So they are not going to feel any fire under their butt necessarily to pick up the ball and run with it the way you do, because it's your future. So take ownership as being the driver of this. Be polite, but be firm. Try to start from the deadlines that are really fixed, that the agency gives you, the funding agency, that the call gives you. Work backwards from those. I would really budget much more time than you think might be needed to get drafts in. You can, you know, on the parts that you can control, you can be flexible. So but you cannot control what their end. So give them as little time as possible, you know, that they may need. I mean, give them good time to work on drafts, but make sure that there's time that if they don't meet the deadline you give them, that there's still time for them to get it to you later. And then you, unfortunately, have to give yourself 24 or 36 hours to do your part on it and get it out the door. So just do not underestimate how much time and how much dilation will happen when you're preparing a grant. By the way, the same is true for a paper that involves multiple authors, whether they're in the same country or in different countries. So yeah, start early, keep on top of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chapin. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Absolutely, sure.
Okay, so a couple of our participants have asked how big a role do references and recommendation letters play in the grant application process, and how much attention one should pay to them?
Great question. I would pay a lot of attention to them. These are integral parts of the application, and especially for younger scientists. So if you imagine a pretty established scientist with an established lab applying for money. For them, it's very easy to establish that they're good and that they're making an impact in the field, and that they're very likely to continue making an impact in the field, because they will show their titles on the grant proposal. They will show all their past publications. They will show all the resources that they can draw on. They have already, over the years, accumulated lots of collaborators. They have a reputation. So when the grant agency picks up the grant, they know that person's name immediately. They know of that person's reputation. By the way, those grant agency people probably have already met those grant applicants at conferences. Remember that grant agencies, they have full-time people, but those full-time people, maybe they're not active researchers, but they routinely go to meetings. And then, of course, grant agencies also use external peer reviewers who are active researchers, just like you. So they're also going to meetings. So how in heaven's name can a young person who has a few papers, who doesn't know anyone in the field, or they don't know them, blah, blah, blah. So your letters of reference will therefore be very important. So you want to make sure that you pick good people who can really talk to you. And here's something else. I don't know how it is in India, but I know it was a rude awakening for me in the US. Understand that it's standard practice now in US, and I suspect in most top centers in Europe. You will write your own reference letter. You will go to your supervisor. You will go to a senior colleague. You'll go to the professor you had in a previous lab, and you will ask them, hi, I'm applying for this fellowship. Would you be willing to support me with a letter? And do not be shocked to find that they would love, they may not ask you, some will ask you outright, yes, I will you draft it for me? Others may not ask you, they may kind of expect you to do it for them, but the bottom line is, I would offer to say, if you would like, I would be happy to draft you something that you can revise as you wish, because you're saving them time. So as much as they love you because you were such a star student in their lab, they're also very busy, yeah? So don't hesitate to approach the right people, think carefully who can attest to your skills, and then offer to write a draft. Then you write a draft and you pay attention to all the things we've been talking about in this workshop, and you send it to them. Probably 8 times out of 10, they'll just put their signature on the bottom and send it. They may also add a few things of their own. I've seen both. I spent several years, by the way, writing reference letters at a big bioengineering institution in Europe. And so I could see a lot of the behind the scenes, and this happened all the time. So the candidate would ask the big boss of the center, the big boss would ask me to do it, and I would do it working with the candidate's materials, talking to the candidate, and that was it. So you are in the best position to know why you're a good candidate, a strong candidate for that proposal. So take advantage of that. And also, just to close, keep on top of deadlines. Your referees don't care about your deadlines. So be polite, but don't hesitate to remind them. Deadlines.
Thanks, Chapin. I think we are out of time now, so I'll hand back to Shantala for wrapping up this session.
Thank you so much, Chapin. Thank you, Shreya. So it's been a really interactive session, and we had a lot of questions come in. Hopefully most of your questions did get addressed through this session, and this is an ongoing kind of conversation on how to write grants and fellowships. So I think at this point we will end the webinar. Thank you so much, Chapin, for this lovely training session. I'm sure everybody learned a lot from it and enjoyed it as well. Thank you also, Smita and Gurlind, for the introductory comments at the beginning, and Shreya and Manjula for moderating the Q&A sessions, both on Zoom and on YouTube. So we'll end here.